Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're cutting straight through the political spin to break down the Trump administration's actions from June 26th through July 2nd, 2026. We're looking at executive orders, memorandums, military moves, the whole shebang. Because honestly, when you look past the messaging, the real story here is all about causality and incentives. We're going to figure out exactly what these decisions mean for the working class and ultimately your bottom line. So here's our roadmap. We've got a week of contradictions, easing working class costs, the tech tariff threat, the Middle East military escalation, the constitutional war clash, and we'll wrap up with the bottom line. All right, Section 1, a week of contradictions. Let's look at the conflicting strategies at play here. This whole week literally perfectly illustrates a massive push and pull within the government. On one hand, you have the June 29th domestic relief actions, right? These are deliberately aimed at easing farm and vehicle costs. But just days before that, on June 26th, we saw international actions that actively escalated military and trade conflicts. So you've got the administration giving with one hand to lower domestic costs while risking major overseas inflation with the other. It produces this huge cloud of uncertainty for businesses trying to figure out where to source parts or invest, and frankly, it puts working-class budgets right in the crosshairs. Moving on to Section 2, easing working-class costs. Let's check out these domestic relief efforts. Okay, so on June 29th, President Trump declared an emergency to temporarily suspend certain anti-dumping and countervailing duties on phosphate fertilizer imported from Morocco for up to 8 months. To pull this off, he tapped into Section 318 of the Tariff Act of 1930. The proclamation basically said, hey, our domestic output just isn't enough after exports, and global supply disruptions are threatening farm production. Now, fertilizer is obviously a massive input cost for anyone growing grain, soybeans, or wheat. So lowering these import duties could seriously reduce cost pressure for farmers and maybe even benefit food prices downstream for all of us. But keep in mind, this is just a temporary band-aid, not a structural fix, and it actually increases our reliance on imported Moroccan fertilizer. Also on June 29th, the administration issued what they're calling the Freedom to Fix Memorandum. This was directed at the EPA to clarify rules around vehicle repairs, with the stated goal of helping consumers, independent mechanics, farmers, and aftermarket manufacturers. But how does this actually play out in the real world? Well, the directive tells the EPA to clarify exactly when repair shops can use aftermarket emissions-related parts, to figure out alternatives to California's certification bottleneck, and to maybe deprioritize some tampering enforcement for people restoring older vehicles in good faith. The administration is framing this as a huge win for lowering vehicle costs. But here's the catch. It doesn't actually repeal the Clean Air Act, and it doesn't instantly legalize modifying your emission system. Its real value in making lawful repairs faster and cheaper completely depends on the specific EPA guidance that's due in 30 days. And without clear execution, weakening enforcement could accidentally flood the market with low-quality, illegal parts. Section 3, the tech tariff threat. Let's pivot to digital services taxes. So, on June 26, the administration threatened European countries, especially France, with a whopping 100% tariff on imports. The trigger? Any country imposing a digital services tax on American companies. The administration basically stated they'd override existing trade agreements just to shield large U.S. technology firms from foreign taxes. Now, let's clear something up, because the mechanics of tariffs are so often misunderstood. A tariff is not a bill paid by a foreign country. When tariffs are slapped on foreign imports, U.S. importers pay that fee at the border. And you guessed it, those costs are almost always passed down in some combination to buyers, suppliers, and workers. So while this massive threat might give some negotiating leverage to giant tech monopolies, the economic downside lands squarely on regular Americans. A tariff war with Europe means intense price hikes for imported consumer goods, vehicle parts, and everyday groceries. Which brings us to Section 4, Middle East military escalation. This is the highest household-level risk of the week. Let's look at the timeline. On June 26th, U.S. forces struck Iranian missile and drone targets after attacks on commercial shipping in the Strait of Hormuz. The administration called this defensive enforcement of a prior ceasefire from June 17th. But things escalated quickly. From June 28th to July 2nd, Iran launched missile and drone attacks on U.S. facilities in Kuwait and Bahrain. Finally, on July 2nd, they announced a highly fragile pause in hostilities, along with plans for technical negotiations over passage through the strait. But honestly, this settlement showed very little evidence of actually holding up long-term. And why does this matter to you? Because there is a direct, undeniable causal link between overseas conflicts and domestic inflation. The Strait of Hormuz is a massive global artery. When it gets disrupted, the cost of oil, shipping, insurance, and fertilizer instantly shoot up. That translates directly to higher gas prices, supply chain inflation, and a bigger grocery bill for your family. It really exposes a deep irony here. The administration's own June 29th emergency declaration for Moroccan fertilizer was an attempt to mitigate a supply shock that this exact regional conflict is helping to sustain. All right, Section 5, the constitutional war clash and how Congress pushed back. In response to those strikes, both chambers of Congress actually passed a war powers measure directing the president to halt operations without congressional authorization. This was highlighted by a nail-biter 50-48 vote in the Senate. Now, the administration heavily contests the practical legal force of this measure, but the constitutional signal it sends, absolutely massive. Congress was explicitly stepping up to assert its Article 1 role, their constitutional authority to decide whether the U.S. continues hostilities. Sure, the administration can make a strong argument that striking back after attacks on commercial shipping is self-defense, but lawmakers were throwing a red flag on the very real risk of mission creep. The danger is that these repeated retaliatory strikes, even if they're all labeled defensive, can quickly snowball into a sustained, open-ended war. And we can't ignore the staggering fiscal weight of this escalation. The White House submitted a massive $87.6 billion supplemental defense request, with much of it designated for Iran-related defense needs. That huge number just goes to show how fast international military escalation turns into a severe budget issue. It puts immense strain on public resources that could otherwise go toward domestic economic security, healthcare, or education for everyday Americans. Finally, Section 6, the bottom line, focusing on our economic security risks. So what does this all mean? The administration is essentially caught in a dangerous feedback loop. As we've seen, shipping disruptions in places like the Strait of Hormuz raise global fertilizer and fuel costs. Those rising costs then create intense pressure back home, practically forcing the government to issue the exact kind of emergency farm waivers we saw on June 29th. Add in the military escalation, expanding the fiscal costs, and you've got a seriously complicated domestic economy. Ultimately, protecting economic security this week relied entirely on temporary stabilization measures, like the fertilizer tariff suspension and a super fragile ceasefire. But tariffs and trade restrictions inherently create bottlenecks that just end up demanding more emergency exemptions down the road. Without long-term structural fixes, American households and working-class budgets are left completely exposed to the financial shockwaves of international conflicts and tech tariff wars. They're the ones bearing the real-world costs of a deeply contradictory policy agenda. As the government continues patching international disruptions with temporary domestic band-aids, it leaves us with one crucial, stark reality to consider. At what point will this fragile economic feedback loop finally break?